Yeah, so there's the National Academy for Social Prescribing have done some work. So they looked at outcomes and they found generally that there is reduced impact on primary care services through using social prescribing. So it's taking people away from local services or primary care services, the GP, the nurse, etc., and it's putting them into a different setting. So there is some evidence for that. So an evaluation done in the London Redbridge area, and again they were finding that there was definitely value in increasing self-esteem and confidence, improvements in psychological mental well-being, reduction in symptoms of anxiety, improvement in physical health as well, because that's one of the things that we can access.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guest is Gilbert Grieve. Gilbert is an experienced manager, trainer and advisor with a history of working in the third sector, but collaborating with the public sector in developing and co-producing services. He's here today to discuss community development and engagement and social prescribing. I'm really pleased to welcome you on today, Gilbert.
It's very nice to be here, thank you.
Great to meet with you, Gilbert. Thanks for coming along. Can you begin by telling us something about your career path? How did you wind up delivering social prescribing? Because it probably wasn't even dreamt of when you first started working.
It's kind of roundabout way, to be honest. I left school with no qualifications and did the usual thing up in Scotland, worked in the steelworks for a few years, and it's one of these things, it was really easy to get into jobs at the time, and it was always you knew somebody that worked in the place, so you would get in. So my mother was a nurse, and I got paid off from the steelworks, and she got me into Hartwood Hospital, which was a big psychiatric hospital at the time up there, and I worked as a nursing assistant for 6-7 years. And during that time, I got married and had a kid, and then started to realise that I had to do something a wee bit more formal. And I suppose I had the notion that I may go and do all grades and things, hires, and go into nursing, and then kind of firmed it up that I would probably be better doing some kind of social work type activity. So I left in '86 and I went and did a year in college doing hires, an HNC in business studies, and then went on to university to do social sciences. Originally I had went in to do social work, but I kind of changed course going through and ended up doing social policy, sociology, and left, graduated in '92, and first I'd started doing some voluntary work around about '90, just to kind of beef up my experience in the kind of professional side. And by accident, I came across Citizens Advice Bureau, and when I got involved with them, I absolutely loved it, and it just really made sense to me. It was almost like one of these moments, nirvana. I was like, oh wow, chance to help people, to help themselves, and that kind of got me engaged in that kind of area of work. And when I graduated in '92, I got a job as a training officer working with mainly young people coming out of school with no qualifications and going and working in care homes. And we were doing the SVQs and care, Scottish Vocational Qualifications. So I'd be doing some of the training work for that. And because of my connections with CAB, we managed to get a programme for a lot of unemployed guys at the time kicking around, finding it very difficult getting employment opportunities. So we set up, it was an old programme, Community Action, I think it was called, something like that. And we recruited young men to go and work as advisors. So I, because of my background in CAB, had a couple of years under my belt by that time. I would do the formal training, and then they would go into the bureaus and get the experience, and that worked really well. And quite a lot of the guys went on to full-time employment within CAB or elsewhere within the sector. So that was me kind of hooked within the voluntary sector. '95, I got the chance of setting up a new CAB in Kirkintilloch in Eastern Berkshire. And that was just wonderful. That was a great experience. Brand new bureau. Nothing had been done in the area before. The whole voluntary sector was underdeveloped in the area at the time. So it was just great to get in, and also it was one of these kind of situations. Nobody knew what they couldn't do, so that meant you could do anything. And it was just great. I really enjoyed it. We set up the bureau, had it operating within a few months, and within 3 years we had it. We'd set up a training centre within it as well, the first national lottery funded training centre in Scotland. Within CAB, we'd started doing vocational qualifications in advice work. We were looking at HSC, etc. And in '98, I was asked to go and work with the council for a year and doing economic development. And I took the chance and hated it. I was just going back into that kind of environment, which is so different for me. I think what I like about the sector is the flexibility and the ability just to be able to do what you feel is right at any given time. Going and working with the council again, it was very much this is your remit, you do this, somebody else will do that. And within a year, it was no, I need to go. So I went and worked for another voluntary organisation for a couple of years in Ayrshire, doing economic development within the kind of social sphere, and came back to Eastern Berkshire in 2000 to set up the Council for Voluntary Service, which I pretty much stayed in. That continued on up until 2017, when I had some health issues, and I pretty much had to go at that time. Required major surgery, and had a couple of years out, and then this post came up in 2019. And it was, for me, it was really just it's great because I didn't particularly want to go back into senior management, so it was an opportunity to utilise the whole range of skills that I've developed over the years, working within communities, working with people, working with GPs. I've done a lot of that in the past as well. So it's kind of accidental, but it's almost like my whole life was preparing for this post. So pretty much everything that I do within the role are things that I've done over the last 30 odd years.
It's a fascinating description of one thing following on another, Gilbert, and you clearly saw or used the citizen advice as a kind of platform for developing things, and it sounds as if you developed and moved off and then came back, and it was a wonderful description, I think, of community activity, or which some politicians like to talk about as the state, but actually you're describing a whole range of disparate services which you developed or were a part of for other people. Tell us then, what is social prescribing? What problems does it set out to solve?
Yeah, so social prescribing is really, so the process basically is you got your GP, you've maybe been going to the GP for a number of years. The GP's treated you for various medical conditions. There may even be a wee bit of surgery thrown in there, and he's got to the stage that he doesn't really know what to do any longer. You're on medication, maybe stress and anxiety issues, or it may be that you've been paid off, you've got your medication, and through the discussion, it becomes obvious that there's other issues there. I think GPs in the last number of years have become more aware that there are social factors impacting on health conditions as well. So they will then basically refer on to it's a wellbeing service, we call it, rather than social prescribing. So I'll get a referral from the GP saying that they've got them on medication for anxiety, etc., but they've maybe mentioned that there's some issues with challenges at work, or they've maybe been paid off and they're really worried about how they're going to survive in universal credit. So that would be the referral. The original concept was to see patients in the GP practice. During COVID, it was mainly phone calls, although in the last couple of weeks I've started going into the GP practices again. So I'll see somebody, got an hour in the first instance, and it's really just a case of tell me your story, just get a bit of background, I don't really need much information up front because they're quite happy to tell you, you know. So they'll start off, finding the GP practices things tend to be a wee bit more challenging to get people to talk because you're seen as being part of that structure and, you know, you get the white coat syndrome, etc. So people are a wee bit kind of nervy for the first 5 or 10 minutes and just keep encouraging them to talk. And we'll, once we get them talking, can you start to identify there's key issues will come out. You know, they'll talk about their money issues, they'll talk about their family situation. If there's any housing situation there, they'll talk about that as well. What we find is in some of there's still some social housing in East and Berkshire, but not much. But it tends to be in areas where they're more likely to be neighbour problems. So things like that, we found that 30% of the inquiries that I've been dealing with have got a neighbour issue, problem with neighbours making noise, drinking, whatever. So these are the sorts of things that will come out. Money issues are you know, way up there. We've contributed quite a bit to the CAB money advice element and to the benefits advice. So start to get an idea that if they're on universal credit, we want to make sure they're getting everything on universal credit they can. And we are also starting to look at personal independence payments as well. So they've got a long-term condition, which most of them have. I would be almost immediately talking to them about PIP, and just say, look, phone the number, say you spoke to your wellbeing advisor, I think you meet the criteria, get the form, and then we'll fill it in from there. So that's the kind of process. The first hour where you really get a chance to identify the key issues for the person. I'll do a wee action plan from that. And there may be referrals on to colleagues within CAB for some of the issues that I've identified. It may be isolation is a big issue as well. So we're really saying, look, got some other voluntary organisations here. We've just set up a lunch club recently and things like that. There's meditation groups, yoga, couch yoga, all these sorts of things. There's walking groups. So talk about that as well, and people are kind of minded to try something a wee bit different. Then again, we can make referrals in. One of the big areas again has also been counselling. Getting access to counselling in the area is very difficult. There's a major waiting list. So again, we've got quite a number of local voluntary organisations that will do the lower level stuff, and it's very basic CVT. So we can usually get somebody into that pretty quickly within a matter of weeks. So we get them on the road, if you like. I'll then do a follow-up call. Either depends on my feeling on how the discussion is going. Most of them I would probably call the following week just to make sure that things are running. We do referrals into social work and OT as well. So I'll do a follow-up in the first week, second week, and then third, fourth week, we'll take it from there, determined by the needs of the person at the time. Some of the older people, I tend to do a weekly contact, and that's really just to make sure that they're okay, that they've got their shopping, and they've got hospital appointments. Again, we can arrange transport to get them to the hospital. We might be looking at befriending as well, try and get somebody to, just to either do a phone call or a visit, or get them out for activities as well. So you've got that range of things starting to run. I tend to keep in touch to make sure that particularly the referrals have been followed up on, and if that's not the case, I'll phone up and say, look, is there a problem? And some cases we need to go elsewhere. You know, there's big waiting lists, or people are just not, particularly within the voluntary sector. Somebody goes off sick within the sector, and the whole service can freeze up. So, but we've got 400 voluntary organisations in Eastern Berkshire, so there's a whole range of voluntary organisations, and then we've also got the public sector as well. We've actually, it's been quite interesting recently, but a few private sector councillors been in touch to see whether I'd be prepared to refer people onto them. And problem we have that is they want to charge. You know, everything that I provide or everything that I refer onto is free of charge. So it would only be where we were really struggling to get the person the right service that we be prepared to talk about, possibly a private sector referral. One of the other areas where we have some difficulty is getting people help for doing housework and things. It used to be many years ago that social work did that. They don't do that. The care at home these days is they'll come in the morning, give you your medication, and then if they come in the evening as well, it's pretty much the same. They'll come at 5 o'clock. If you need to go to bed, if you need help to get to bed, you're put to bed at 5 o'clock, and people don't like that. It's just not meeting their needs, So one of the things that we've been talking to voluntary organisations about is, could we set up something within the voluntary sector helping people to get their housework done? That's quite a challenging area because we'd be stepping on toes in the private sector in that, and there's all it would be a really difficult area to manage. But it's a challenge we see that we should be looking at. So that's been one of the discussions that I've been having recently with people.
I was just going to ask Gilbert, a Citizens Advice Bureau up and down England, Scotland and Wales all doing this, or is this specific to where you are?
So we're the only social prescribing bureau in Scotland at the moment, as far as I'm aware. There are some other bureaus that will do money advice or benefits advice into GP surgeries or into other kind of health organisations. The social prescribing was originally set up outside of CAB. It was actually done by other voluntary organisations. I think Women's Royal Voluntary Service in Scotland was one of the first. So we just kind of came in recently, and it makes sense, I think, for a CAB to be involved in this because of the range of internal services we have. But most of the social prescribing is done by other voluntary organisations who would then see CAB as one route to refer in. For us, it's a lot easier. I can get access. I just do the referral to the service manager, and a CAB advice worker is identified straight away. And so all that kind of thing is done a lot quicker. So I noticed Blackpool have started doing it recently down south, and I think there's a couple of other CABs I've seen been advertising for the same idea. So the projects are seen as link workers. So kind of link worker project, they don't actually often identify it as social prescribing, although that's what it is. And there is a social prescribing network, etc. And the concept is really, the workers that tend to be used are seen as link workers. It's really interesting again as well because there seems to be more value on the role of Scotland, even although I think England actually started this first. The posts are higher value up here, but it's quite interesting. So I think it's level 5 or something like that within the NHS pay structure in Scotland. It seems to be lower down south. So concept, I think, originally starting down south, been picked up in Scotland in the last number of years. As far as I'm aware, every local authority in Scotland has now got one. I think we were one of the last to come in the last 3 years there, but we've just recently done a report internally. It was the health service done it, and the GPs love it. They really like it. It's giving them another option for particularly the longer term patients. And this is one of the other things, patients when I'm in the GP practice, clients when I'm working with the voluntary sector. So the patients, again, a lot of positive feedback to the GPs. The GPs are loving the project, and it was originally for 2 years. We've just had that extended in the last 6 months, so we've got another 2 years for the project. And one of the things that we are looking at is the feedback and how can we make sure that we get that formalised as well. So there probably will be within the next 6 months a more formal report done, looking at outcomes, etc., that we've been set up to achieve.
You're reminding me that many years ago when I worked in social services in Oxford, we had a very good home help service who did some of the things that you're describing. So I suppose in some respects you're picking up the pieces for a lack of funding over many years in this particular area.
Yeah, that's interesting because what you would have had previously would be within CAB in Eastern Berkshire, we actually picked that service up. We have got 3 or 4 welfare rights officers that feed into this project as well. But I think you're right. I think the whole structure of social work has changed so much in the last 20 years that probably social work would have done a lot of this in the past. And as that's changed and they've moved more into the kind of managerial role under the Community Care Act, then it's just left gaps. And that's one of the things that sector's good at filling.
Thank you. So you've touched upon this to some extent, Gilbert, but what do you think of the strengths and weakness of doing this work through the GP?
Yeah, I think the GP's concept, I think, is really good, and understand why they originally wanted the post holders to be in the GP surgery, because you're seen as being part of the service. I think there's strengths and weaknesses in that. As I say, if I'm in a GP practice, I spend 10, 15 minutes, sometimes a wee bit longer, breaking down some of the barriers because I'm seen as being part of that service. They probably think I'm a GP. And you can see, the body movement, people are, can they go over the place, the legs are going, they're just really anxious. And so I spend a bit of time, sometimes even I'll just talk about myself, and how I've been that week and whatnot, just to try and kind of relax the person. So I think we've got a wee bit of that.
Sorry, Gilbert, I was just wondering, why do you think people are more anxious when they see you in a GP surgery? What is it about being seen there that evokes the anxiety?
Well, I think it is just the whole structure, going and seeing your GP. We know the kind of the way people have viewed GPs over the years, the way they're treated within the NHS system as well. They've got that major authority. They tend to be, I wasn't at school with any GPs or any sons with GP families, so you don't really, most people don't think come into contact with them. So there's that kind of just psychological, social kind of factors come into play, and I think that's there. I notice when I go into the GP surgery and get my blood pressure taken, it's through the roof, the white coat syndrome. So I think that's just there, whether we like it or not. And I was actually quite surprised when I realised that I had that, because I don't feel anxious when I'm in a GP, speaking to a GP. I don't feel that they're gods any longer, maybe 20 years ago, but so I do things differently these days. So I think there is just that social structural aspect where people are a wee bit nervy going into something that they're really not sure. You kind of lose control when you get into GPs, because they're in control. They're the one who will tell you what the problem is. So I think there's all that sort of stuff going on. I didn't notice that to the same extent when I was phoning people in their own houses. I was phoning. They seemed more assertive, more in control, because they could turn, they could put the phone down. It happened a couple of times actually. So I think that there's that there. I don't know to what extent other people would make that argument, but I've definitely, seen it and I feel it as well. I think there's definitely that aspect. And I have spoke to a couple of people in the practice who kind of agreed that there probably is something going on there.
Thank you. And you kind of mentioned already that that there's some work being done to collect feedback, but I wondered more generally if there's any tangible evidence that social prescribing works.
Yeah, so there's the National Academy for Social Prescribing have done some work, and there has been, if you bear with me a wee second, I have something on my screen, I can try and find it. So they looked at outcomes and they found generally that there is reduced impact on primary care services through using social prescribing. So it's taking people away from local services or primary care services, the GP, the nurse, etc., and it's putting them into a different setting. So there is some evidence for that. There was a report done in London in 2020, and I can't read my own writing. Bertotti, Frestique, and Temrar or something like that. So an evaluation done in the London Redbridge area, and again they were finding that there was definitely value in increasing self-esteem and confidence, improvements in psychological mental well-being, reduction in symptoms of anxiety, improvement in physical health as well, because that's one of the things that we can access. We can get people into the local gyms, reduction in social isolation, and that's a major issue. Improvement in motivation, meaning in life, and again through some of the meditation, yoga. And one of the other areas that really doesn't surprise me is the acquisition of learning new skills. So we've been working with the local authority to try and get people onto education programs, into college, and work related. So the research is showing outcomes improvement in all these areas.
That's really helpful, thank you. And perhaps actually, if you share the references afterwards, we can put a link to them in the show notes then, because I think people might be interested to hear that.
Yeah.
It sounds like
one of the other areas. So it relates to that question. I don't know if we come back to it, but particularly with the way we're working, we would easily be able to evidence an increase in income through the number of people that are going to PIP and other benefits where available. And one of the other things we'll do is we'll look at other charities that may be able to provide. So, for example, Rafa, we had a really good case where a chap was going to lose his house through ill health, and Rafa came in and kept the mortgage going until we managed to get the PIP payment sorted. So that's an area I would definitely expect to see economic increase in the amount of money coming into patients.
So you can hear that there's really very tangible evidence of it working for individual clients, but it also sounds like there's probably a benefit to the wider organisations in terms of efficiency, because actually if people are having their needs met at this level, they're less likely to require more specialist services further down the line. It might be more costly. And I wondered, Gilbert, do you end up having to advocate for your clients? And if so, how do you manage that tension between representing the client and also acting for the NHS?
Yeah, I make it clear that I'm from CAB, so although the project is funded by the NHS, I do make people aware as early as possible that I'm actually employed by CAB. So I think that deals with some of that. I'm not supposed to be advocating on a case-by-case basis. There are other organisations that will do that. We have an advocacy organisation called CARETIS, which is a Scottish word for fairness. So I would do a referral. In practice, sometimes I'll do a wee bit. Most of my people would tend to go to other advisors for PIP, etc. There's a few people that I've just held on to because it would be too much anxiety, too much stress involved with passing them on to somebody else. So I do get involved a wee bit on a case-by-case basis, kind of advocating. In relation to, I suppose I've got 30 years experience being in the middle between the sector and the public sector, so I'm quite conscious of the tension areas where they exist. So we've not had any major problems. I show respect to any service providing that they're meeting the needs of their patients, their clients, or whatever. So we haven't had any major problem, but I think it is, there are different cultures within different types of services. Even within the public sector, you've got very different cultures between the council and the NHS. So I think an awareness of that helps, because if you're conscious that that's there, then you can work your way around about that. And it's not, I think today it's not been a major problem for us.
And you gave us a really good description of your background prior to your current role. Is that fairly typical of people that work in social prescribing, or do you see a whole mixture of people?
Yeah, I think it's quite typical of people that worked in the voluntary sector. They tended to be in various different sectors and then end up in the voluntary sector. My daughter just recently has started working in the voluntary sector, and she was in the private sector previously, worked in pubs and whatnot, and lo and behold, she's ended up working in a charity. I'm trying to remember which one it is. It's one of the big ones. It's a church, a faith-related charity. It's not popping into my head. But I think that's quite common that people, as they go through their career, for whatever reason, one of the reasons I got involved was skills development. And I think that's quite common for people in their 30s, 40s. They see the opportunity. They maybe went back to university or college and see an opportunity of being able to do something practical. The other end of the coin tends to be people early retired, going and doing some voluntary work as well. So what was the question?
No, I was asking whether whether your background of in the third sector was quite typical of people.
Yeah, so I think what tends to happen is because people come in through voluntary organisations, they'll have quite a mixed bag. And I think that you would be looking, so I'm trying to think of my other two colleagues. Jane was a RMN nurse, registered mental health nurse, but had also worked in the voluntary sector doing social prescribing. So we've got that mix there. I think most of the people that I come across tend to have been across a range of organisations and maybe even sectors as well, and ended up in the voluntary sector. And when you're in the voluntary sector, because of the nature of funding in the sector, you tend to kind of almost reskill every few years. So as a new opportunity comes up, you maybe have to kind of add a wee bit of skills development in there as well to be able to move. So within community development, you've got a whole range of activities they might be involved in.
And you spoke earlier about plugging the gaps in statutory service provision. I wonder if you had any thoughts about this this tendency that there is for gaps to be left, and then third sector having to get involved to plug those gaps.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one, and on the one side, politically, it really annoys me that happens, but on the other side, that's what the voluntary sector do. The voluntary sector, community groups see something, a gap in the area, and we're the sort of people that just want to go in and do something, fill that gap. So that happens all the time. There has been more understanding, I think, in the last 20 years, though, that there's a need to fund that when you identify a gap. When I started working in the voluntary sector, it was very much voluntary. Everything was done voluntary. It's not really, we've tended to move to calling the sector the social enterprise sector these days rather than the voluntary sector, because when I started with CAB, there was one paid post. And when I opened up Eastern Bartonshire, there were two paid posts. There's now 28 paid staff in that same bureau. So there's been a whole cultural, economic tsunami, if you like, within the voluntary sector. So although we're filling gaps, I think it's about identifying where something is no longer being provided within the public sector, but more often than not, they will find some cash for that. So, for example, social prescribing is funded in most cases by a mixture of health and local authorities. But that's not necessarily the way it used to be. One of the other reasons that we're pretty good at filling the gaps and supported by the public sector, and that's that we can bring in funding from elsewhere. So I think, is it deliberate sometimes that they may decide that they don't really need to do something because they think, well, another voluntary organisation will see that gap and find funding elsewhere. There might be some of that going on. I think, yeah, I could probably think of projects in the past where at the end of the day, and again over the last 20 years, there's been so much cuts to local authority funding, health board funding, etc., that they've had to draw back. And what we provide predominantly within the sector is what is identified as low-level, non-statutory. So if there's going to be cuts, that's where the cuts will be. There's no loss as far as they're concerned because they don't have to do it. That's not something it's one of these things that's really nice to do, but we don't have to. So if the community want it, we've got to find another way of doing that. And that's, I think, where the voluntary sector is pretty good at working with the community. At the end of the day, the voluntary sector is a community. It's made up by people that live in the area and have recognised that something that might have been provided previously by statutory provision is no longer there. So can we try and get that up and running? We miss it. We think it's really necessary. And the other side of the coin, obviously, is some of the new service development. One of the things, there's, I suppose, a fear, if you like, within the Bureau at the management level that if this project continues to be as successful as it is, the NHS are likely to take it over. There is a possibility that may happen because they then recognise that, that service really is needed, it's really successful, we should do that. And being the professional, they could probably do it better than we could. So there is, this happens as well. I've seen quite often something that's working quite well because of the flexibility within the voluntary sector that becomes really popular, and public sector feel that they should be, that's a service. And I get this as well. This sometimes comes from the community themselves, that, you should be providing this. So that's what happens. And then you maybe get a kind of vicious circle with them doing it for a few years, and then it's no longer a priority, and it drops off, comes back into the voluntary sector.
That does happen, doesn't it? And but I found it very interesting, this conversation, Gilbert, because actually I started work at a time when statutory services did want to do something. They did want to do things, and if there was a gap, they would work actively to fill it. So we had in Oxford, where I worked, we had free access to counselling services. We had a good drugs service. We had therapeutic community and outreach services for mental health. And of course then, following that, there was a massive shift of funding away from some of these projects into the voluntary sector. I'm also thinking that there was probably some demographic factors here, in that I suspect things weren't exactly the same in Kirkintilloch or East Dumbarton as they were in Oxford. So that there was an imbalance of funding across the country as a whole, I think.
One of the things that changed about 20 years ago, though, there used to be a lot of European funding that came into local authorities, I don't know if the Health Board got it, but definitely the local authorities got it. And they would set up community projects, but it would be funded through the local authority because they were the group that got the funding. About 20 years ago that changed, and they were no longer able to access that funding. You could only get that funding through the voluntary organisations going for it. One of the other problems that they had when they were doing that is they were taking on 3 years funding for a project, and then once they had it up and running, finding it very difficult to let that project go. It's easier if they've got arm's length on that. So I think that's why you may find that some of that's happened, because it definitely happened in Glasgow. We didn't have as much funding coming into Kirkintilloch because it was a kind of leafy suburbs. But Glasgow definitely had that problem 20 years ago, that the local authorities were doing all the drugs work, all the anti-poverty work, and then all of a sudden that was dropped because they were getting 3 years, maybe 5 years for it, and then they were having to pick up money, and with the cuts to their budgets, they just weren't able to do that in the longer term. So it's very sad because it is the areas that you mentioned there, the addictions, the counselling, etc., that people need, and as a byproduct to society, I think it's something that's needed to allow you to function normally within society as well. So, and again, that's why the sector is there to try and plug these gaps where possible. But we don't do it just because we want to, such as because we feel there's a need, and we're always very conscious, more so in the last number of years, about trying to get the local authorities to come in and support that as well. So we've probably been better at that, at making the kind of connections between the sector and local authority, health board, etc. So the working relationship, the joint working has definitely been, what is it they call it? There's a name for it, particularly within health, the joint production of projects and things as well. So they've definitely been very keen to do that over the last number of years.
Thank you. So what are some of the downsides of working in the third sector?
It tends to be poorer paid. That we don't, you may be in a project for 3 or 4 years. We don't focus as probably enough on the benefit side of things, to be honest. We find it difficult to get money sometimes, and that money is very much about keeping the service going. So we don't. I notice when even when I've been in senior management positions, I never really looked after the workforce probably the way I should have. Because you see yourself as a voluntary organisation, so it creates a different cultural way of working, and I think that's something that we should be doing more about. I think I see it in some organisations. So if you look at even CAB, there's a whole range of values for posts up and down the country, depending on who's running that. The board and the manager, if they're more focused on getting reward for their staff, then there can be quite a bit of variation. And I do think it comes out of this focus. We get in the voluntary sector, particularly if you've been there for a long time, you're not really looking too much at that kind of reward. I mean, I get a lot of rewards for working in the voluntary sector, and I get paid, but equally just being able to do what I do is reward as well. But we should be focusing more, and I think that's something with the current economic situation. Definitely we should be focusing more. But I think there is quite a variation even within the sector, and if you look at equivalent positions in the public sector, they tend to be better paid than they would be within the voluntary sector. That's a long-term issue, and again it goes back to predominantly 20, 30 years ago it was predominantly females, it was predominantly retired professionals. There wasn't the same need or demand, if you like, for or concern even about, well, we need to make sure that this is, at the end of the day, this is reward for what we're doing. So I think that's all the kind of factors come into play there. So that's one of the downsides. But I think that the upside is, I find, having worked in different sectors, I find the flexibility in the voluntary sector is just me. It just, I find it very difficult working to a very set regime, where you've got that flexibility, the opportunity to go and try new things. And some people are really comfortable. I've worked with people in the voluntary sector that, you're going to think after a year or two, you're just not going to, it's no you, you need structure. And there are some posts within the sector, particularly welfare rights, you get that structure, but a lot of the development work and development workers within the sector tend to be very flexible. They're prepared to kind of and accept that you need to try and do things as well. And that's part of the way the funding works as well. You'll get 3 years funding for a project, and unlikely to get that project funded again unless you change some of the elements of that project. So that's something we spoke to the lottery about so the lottery's been running 30 years, I think. So we've had that conversation, because that is a problem as well, that we have to keep changing, and rather than get really, really good at particular services, we have to keep making minor changes. So there's strengths and weaknesses to that as well. You're providing something that people really like, and then all of a sudden you've got to make a slight change to that.
Great, thanks very much for that. So slightly left turn here with this question, because if we think about how abuse of power has emerged in so many institutions that cater for vulnerable people, what safeguards does an organisation such as the CAB have in place to ensure that it isn't infiltrated by those who want to abuse others?
Yeah, I think we probably have very similar safeguarding structures to the public sector, because we were originally partly created through a public sector partnership. So there's always been that element. Some of the smaller voluntary organisations struggle with some of the policy frameworks and things. You have in most areas, if not all, a council for voluntary service, or in Scotland a third sector interface. That's their role, to make sure that voluntary organisations are looking at these sorts of questions to support them, writing policies, accessing policies, looking at safeguarding issues, and where a small organisation doesn't have the resources for that, then perhaps helping them identify the resources to do that. So I would say we're probably very similar in our approach to the local authorities and the health board themselves. We've got policies for everything, and although we don't have an HR department as such, we buy in that service. And the bigger players tend to do that as well. Bigger players in the sector will have their own HR departments. Notwithstanding, we have the same problems. If you look over the years, there's been a few voluntary organisations struggled on that as well, but so have the public sector. So to try and answer the question, I think the bigger players probably find it easier, because that becomes part of your funding stream as well, that you have to get evidence. One of the things that has been really pleasing for me in the last 20 years, there's been more recognition by the sector of the need to adopt good practice, and particularly good practice within the business sector. So the social enterprise model is very much, most of the voluntary organisations in Scotland bought into the European framework for quality management, for example. So that's 9 key areas, and policy, etc., would be part of that as well. So as part of your kind of ongoing management and looking at your risk assessments, etc., you would have guidance for the manager and the board as well. Because at the end of the day, most voluntary organisations are companies of some sort, so they've got the same limited liability. If they're breaking the law, then they're going to lose their limited liability. So I think there's been more awareness, more consciousness of these sorts of the need to look at policy and guidance, etc. I don't know if that answers your question, David, but that's probably the best I can do.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think also you're saying that something about changes in culture, which is perhaps making you and your teams a bit more observant of what's going on.
Yeah. I think it is. I remember going back about 15, 20 years, there was a group of guys came into the area, and they wanted to set up a project to help battered women, and we were like, a group of guys, helping battered women. That's not going to get done very well. And we managed to kind of counsel them, if you like, out of doing that with the help of Women's Aid. So it's about, but that would have came from their real desire, a couple of guys, real desire to help, but just not really thinking through the implications of that. Probably not, and we know not that's not the case. So you do get the desire to help very strong within the voluntary sector, and sometimes it's just not practical. It's not, it's not the right thing to do as well. So we have loads of consciousness, I think, of the kind of good practice stuff, because we've been bitten as well over the years with organisations, doing things that have been out of kilter with legislation, etc. So there's in Scotland, every single local authority area has a third sector interface, which is the equivalent of a CVS, and their role is to go in and firefight with organisations if there's any problems, to make sure that they go for the best structure that they can have in relation to how their board operate as well, all the policies, HR, everything really goes with that as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Gilbert, have you seen an impact on your work with the growing cost of living crisis? I imagine that could have really affected your service.
I think I've been surprised how quickly that's happened. over the last 3 or 4 months, I've heard it in the office where people come up to you and they're really quite distressed. And this is staff, that are quite distressed, and it's like, what's happening? I don't feel there's anything else I can do. I've exhausted the normal organisations I would go to. The normal, like St Vincent de Paul, are a charity in Scotland, it's a Catholic charity. They're absolutely fantastic. They provide support to anybody. I've went to them a few times and they've no money left. And I've never experienced that in 40 years of working with voluntary organisations. So even in the last 3 months, I've come across that myself. I've had to go to 2 or 3 different organisations where previously I would have probably first hit, I would have got something. We're seeing it's an increase already in severe debt, what we call multi-debt. We're probably seeing an increase in the amount of people we're putting onto PIP, because universal credit is just not sustainable. The amount of money people get on universal credit is really a struggle to cope with. So if you've got a long-term condition, a health condition, straight away we're looking at getting people onto PIP. So we've seen something like a 20% increase in our workload over the last couple of years, 2 years since COVID. And what we're finding actually is that that's not an increase in outcomes per se, it's an increase in the amount of time we're spending with people. So it's the severity of the problems that they're coming with is taking longer to resolve. And we have actually been quite active in the last couple of months trying to get, I've been working with a local charity who provide cash for people in need. Been trying to get them to set up a project going into the winter. So we're anticipating we're going to have a lot of people, more people than we have at the moment, not being able to put the heating on. And we've had a few cases like that, even coming out at the end of the winter there, they weren't able to, a woman, severe mental health issues, physical issues, had been in bed for 3 days because she just didn't have the money to put the electricity on. So really worried about that. And what's it going to be like going into the winter when it really starts to bite? So I think in a policy framework, we've got to see something. What's been done so far is just not going to make enough change. It's nice to see 300-400 quid coming into people, but it's not going to be enough. And even the tax cuts, so you're going to have most people an extra 300 quid. That's just not going to do it.
How do you cope with the emotional impact of seeing so much poverty? Because I imagine it must be awful to see people facing those kind of levels of poverty where they can't get out of bed because they're not going to be warm. How do you cope with that?
I don't know, actually. That's a really good question. I probably don't. I think, if I'm being honest, we struggle. We've had this discussion. So this is a relatively new project where we've been spending this level of time. And I think in other social prescribing projects, there has been counselling services provided for the staff. We've not done that. You've not been down that route yet. I think we do need to do that because I suppose I manage it through my personal activities, going and visiting people and bit of hill walking, some cycling. But I really worry going into this winter. I think the organisation, from an organisational perspective, we're probably going to have to do more to protect the staff as well, because it is to hear CAB advice workers saying, I've run out of options. I've never heard that before. And I've 30 years with CAB, I've never heard it before. So I do think we're going to have to do what we do. I don't know yet. We've not had that opportunity to have that level of discussion, but we are going to have to do something.
I hear you saying that you use a lot of activities as a way of keeping yourself nourished, despite doing a job that brings you up against some really challenging aspects of society. But I wondered, does Citizens Advice staff have clinical supervision, to reflect on the emotional impact of the work?
No, it's more, normally it would be work-based supervision. This project, I think, requires psychological supervision, and we've been having the conversation about getting that. We've not done that yet. There has been some discussion with the health board as well, because I think they've done it for other voluntary organisations. So it will happen. It's just been there's been real strains on our management team in the last wee while as well. There's been a bit of ill health there. So I think that the staff are conscious of that as well, that we probably could be pushing a bit more for that. And I think it is, it's necessary and it needs to come, but it's not there yet. So, but it's not normally within CAB, it would just be work-based supervision. And I think this project, having worked in every aspect of CAB, this is a very different way of working with our clients than the normal. So normally with CAB, a person comes with a problem and you help them fix that problem and you don't see them again. That's not the way we're operating. We're ongoing, we're triage, and because they're building a relationship with us, they'll come back to us. So even when they've got another problem, we're finding that rather than go to the GP, they'll come straight back to the wellbeing advisor, which is fine because we just log them back into the system. And quite often it is even a few kind of consumer-based inquiries and things like that. So people are seeing that as a kind of quick way into the CAB service as well. So
it's great that you find that hill walking and cycling really feeds you and keeps you nourished to cope. Have you got any advice for our listeners about how to cope with working with more challenging aspects?
Yeah, I use mindfulness a lot as well, and a lot in psychological processes. And I think it is about finding what works for you as well, though. And I know other people will deal with that in very personalised ways. So I think just look at, finding something that allows you to kind of take your mind away from whatever it is you're dealing with. I'm probably not the best in the world for for doing that, because. But again, that's my way of coping with things, trying to think through the political options as well. And quite often I'll get in touch with politicians that I know and say, like, you're going to have to think about what you're doing here and how that works and how that's impacting on. So, but that's me, I just like to deal with things in that particular way. I don't always find it easy switching off. But,
Thank you, Gilbert. It's been great to talk to you today. Really interesting.
Yeah, thanks very much for giving me the time. It's been great to talk about the service. You'll probably notice that I really love what I'm doing, and I think it is the opportunity to be able to help people to help themselves is really, for me, what life is about. So, thanks.
Thank you, Gilbert. Really nice to meet you.
And you, David. It's a pleasure.